Whether or not a specific technological so-called solution works, the idea that you can solve these problems through more and more technology is very seductive to a society that, number one, has a kind of technological fundamentalism and believes in that, and number two, doesn't want to deal with the underlying political realities that, in fact, and this is what I think the film doesn't do a very good job of, is the reason we still have nuclear weapons is nuclear weapons are a source of power. And for a nation state trying to impose imperial control on the world, they're useful. That's why the US government, and Barack Obama is no different, he gave a famous speech in Prague in 2009 talking about the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. His Nuclear Defense Posture Review, which came out in 2010, talks about the eventual abolition. It's always, nuclear abolition for American politicians is one of those things that's always down the road. It's always just over the horizon. But in our lifetime, no, well, obviously we can't do it. What the US government is trying to pursue is nuclear non-proliferation to limit the spread of weapons, to limit competition in a sense. Non-proliferation, while it's important from my point of view, it's, there are lots of people in the world I wish didn't have, I hope don't get nuclear weapons. But non-proliferation is not nuclear abolition. And they're very different. And the US has always pursued non-proliferation, even though it's in radical violation itself of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's supported nuclear weapons for allied nations. The hypocrisy is pretty deep, and that's what the film is clearly has a political agenda, which is to mobilize people to support a reduction and eventual abolition of nuclear weapons. So it doesn't go into some of these details. At least, the Obama administration is moving to modernize. The phrase is we want to modernize the arsenal, right? Which sounds kind of benign. I mean, who doesn't want to modernize? But of course, that's part of continuing to make sure the United States is the dominant nuclear power in the world. And I would just like to sort of reinforce that. I think it's really important. When we were contacted at St. Andrews about screening this film, all I had seen was the trailer. We talked about it, and I had a kind of odd feeling about it. And then when it arrived in the mail, my odd feeling was confirmed. So I thought about just breaking the disc, but then I thought that wasn't fair because people were going to come and watch. And so then I think, as Lisa's pointing out, the task is, if this is going to be part of the cultural conversation, and the focus is going to be on those crazy Muslims in Pakistan who may blow up the world, then we have to enlarge that discussion and put this in a context. The film, I think the real narrative of the film is, we made nuclear weapons in 1945 and now we feel bad about it. But now we are the savior. Right? Now the United States will lead the global campaign to create a safe world. And all of the evidence of the last 60 years contradicts that message, and that's what we have to come up with.
I don't really worry that much about a nuclear threat, although maybe I should have, having seen the film. But I can tell you with a lot of passion in my voice what I do fear about in this country, and you touched on that. In this country, we have a lot of fundamentalist churches. And there's one in San Antonio, you've probably heard of that one, and they want to bring on Armageddon, and they are working with, a lot of these people in these fundamentalist churches are getting into government, trying to influence government. They want Armageddon, and they say it's all going to happen in the Middle East, Israel, and they support whatever Israel is doing. So that is my fear in this country, but nobody else has looked at that, and maybe I'm overblowing, maybe it's too much in my mind. But could somebody comment on these fundamentalist churches, and you've seen them all around, that's what they preach, fear. And they want to bring on Armageddon, and I even read in this one book that they would be happy to see a nuclear war happen.
Well, certainly there are elements within the Christian tradition here in the United States that look at, Revelation and rapture and all of that stuff. I don't think anybody's worried that officials in the US government, even those with fundamentalist Christian views, would set off global thermonuclear war. That is, the kind of missile attacks that would literally destroy the world. Everybody realizes that's, a game over. I think the question is, to take it out of the nuclear context, would there be people within the military who might desire that end? Would tactical nuclear weapons, remember We have strategic nuclear weapons for that massive sort of scenario. But there's also tactical nuclear weapons, which seems like a crazy idea that you would use them in limited battlefield situations, but the military does, in fact. You can find people in the military who talk about that. I hope there's no one with their finger near the button that's thinking about the book of Revelation. Although, who knows?
The whole business of U.S. support of Israel is huge in all these considerations, I think, right?
I think that's really important. We've at least reached a level in the United States now where we acknowledge Israel has a nuclear arsenal. For a long time, the U.S. government would not even publicly, recognize the question. It's problematic because, of course, Israel is not the film, I ducked out for a minute, but I don't think it talked about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, did it? Did it explain the risk? So just sort of for context, in 1970, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty went into effect. At the time, there were 5 nuclear nations, acknowledged nuclear nations: the United States, the Soviet Union, China, France, and Great Britain. And the bargain struck in the NPT was that non-nuclear states would not seek to acquire nuclear weapons, and that nuclear states would proceed in good faith toward abolition. Okay. Now, obviously, the nuclear states have not proceeded in good faith toward abolition. None of them have taken that seriously. The non-nuclear states of the signatories to that NPT have held to the bargain. Since those original 5, there are 4 additional nuclear states now: India and Pakistan, which are not signatories, and North Korea, which withdrew from the treaty, and Israel, which was never a signatory as well. Israel's had nuclear weapons for a long time. The U.S. government has been aware of it. It was secret. It was revealed, as the film hinted at, in a sort of leak out of a scientist in Israel. And for a long time, the U.S. simply would not acknowledge that it understood that Israel had nuclear weapons, because it would radically change, by law, what our support for Israel would have to look like. But it reminds us that these things are all connected. So we are all obsessed with Iran and the possibility of Iran getting a bomb. As many people have pointed out, if you're a leader in Iran and you're not seeking a nuclear weapon, you're irrational. Why? You have an enemy in the region, Israel, which has probably a couple hundred nuclear warheads. You have another enemy in the region occupying 2 adjacent countries, that is the US and Iraq and Afghanistan, which has the largest nuclear arsenal and is, a sworn enemy of you. Pakistan is not far down the road. You're in a world in which the only really sure bet to avoid invasion is to be nuclear armed. Right? So if you're Iranian and you're not pursuing a nuclear weapon, you're probably, not a good patriot. Okay, now where does that threat to Iran come from? This says nothing about whether one supports the Iranian state or not in its current form. It's just a recognition that nation states live in the real world and they respond to real world threats and possibilities. And so all of this is part of the same story. You'll notice there wasn't a whole lot of talk about that in this film as well. There's a difference between reasonable fears about threats in the world, which is different than fear-mongering. I think of fear-mongering as trying to direct people here and not there, and using fear to say, here's where the threat is. The threat from nuclear weapons is real enough, and the film makes that clear. The question, I think, is in what context do people see this film, and how do they understand that threat? This film, I think, and people can chime in with different opinions, this film posits that the United States is the repository of sort of rational, moral force in the world. And it directs the attention toward the sort of rogues, the Iranians, the Pakistanis. Now, I've been to Pakistan. In a lot of ways, it's a very scary place, I agree. It is unstable and all of that's true enough. But the question is, where does the threat come from, and who has the capacity to actually change? Well, that's where I think we're talking about different frameworks and different analyses. So if you